The chamber echoed with a sound that didn't belong. A sharp, mocking laugh, unguarded and dismissive, cut through the solemn air of the Senate. It wasn't just a laugh, it was a performance, derisive, casual, almost daring the room to accept it. Lindsey Graham leaned back with a smirk, as if the gravity of the debate were beneath him, as if voices that challenged him were nothing more than background noise. The sound rolled across the table like a stone dropped in water, rippling with disrespect. All eyes shifted. Some tried to hide discomfort, others pretended not to notice, but one figure did not flinch. Jasmine Crockett, steady and composed, let the moment hang in the air. Her gaze fixed on Graham. Sharp, unwavering, the look of someone who has lived through condescension before and learned not only to endure it, but to transform it into fuel. The contrast was striking. His laughter, careless and arrogant, her silence, heavy with power. The cameras captured everything: the laugh, the smirk, the dismissive wave of a hand, and then the quiet strength in Crockett's stare. For a split second, the chamber seemed to split into two worlds. One belonged to the past, the politics of ridicule and mockery; the other, to the present, where dignity stood its ground. Viewers at home felt it instantly, a clash of energy, arrogance meeting resolve. The laugh lingered in the air, louder than words. It spoke of entitlement, of years of unchecked superiority. But Crockett's eyes told another story, of patience, of resilience, of someone unwilling to let that laugh go unanswered. This was no ordinary exchange. It was the kind of moment that defines reputations, the kind of moment that millions replay, hear meme, share, and dissect. In the stillness after the laugh, time seemed to slow. Graham, still amused, tapped his pen against the desk as if daring Crockett to rise. The room leaned in, the silence now thicker than the laugh itself. Everyone knew the script he expected: irritation, a stumble, a retreat. But Crockett wasn't following his script. She was writing her own. And as she prepared to speak, the air shifted. His laughter had filled the room once. What came next would silence it forever. But what came next turned that laugh into silence. The Senate chamber was already tense before the laugh. It had been a long morning, hours of questioning and testimony circling the same volatile issues: power, accountability, and the future of American democracy. Every seat was filled, every microphone live, every camera locked on the faces of the committee. The air held a certain electricity, the kind that comes when words alone feel heavier than weapons. This was not a minor hearing, nor a casual exchange of views. The questions before the committee carried consequences far beyond the walls of that chamber. Policy, precedent, even the unwritten rules of dignity in public life, everything hung in the balance. To the outside world, the clash unfolding here would shape how citizens saw their leaders, and perhaps more importantly, how leaders saw each other. Lindsey Graham, seasoned, calculating, had slipped into his familiar role. The unshakable skeptic, armed with sarcasm and dismissal. It was a strategy he had used for years, one that often worked to belittle opponents, reduce their voices to noise, and project himself as untouchable. His laugh, therefore, wasn't just an accident. It was a move, deliberate and sharp, a way of turning a serious point into a punchline. But not everyone in the chamber belonged to the old playbook. Jasmine Crockett, relatively new on the national stage, carried with her the urgency of a different era. She represented communities often silenced, citizens too often brushed aside, and she entered the room with a determination that every word spoken should matter. Her posture was proof enough: straight-backed, hands steady, gaze cutting through, the theatrics around her. Where Graham leaned on entitlement, Crockett leaned on earned strength. This clash wasn't about a single laugh. It was about two visions of power colliding head-on. On one side, the politics of dismissal, where authority mocks challenges and laughs off inconvenient truths. On the other, the politics of dignity, where calm composure can itself be a weapon, sharper than any insult. Everyone in the room could sense it. The committee wasn't simply debating policy, it was debating the very idea of respect. Outside the chamber, the country was watching. Screens across America flickered with live coverage, from cable news to social media feeds. Clips were already circulating, the laugh, the stare, the uneasy silence that followed. People leaned forward in break rooms, dormitories, and living rooms, sensing that something bigger was unfolding than just another Washington exchange. It felt like a story breaking in real time, one that would ripple through headlines and hashtags. By nightfall, the stakes were no longer confined to the committee. They had grown into something symbolic. For millions watching, this wasn't about Graham and Crockett alone. It was about what kind of leadership the country was willing to tolerate. Would arrogance go unchecked? Would mockery still pass as strength? Or would dignity finally seize the floor and shift the balance? The silence after the laugh carried the weight of that question. It was as if the entire chamber leaned forward, waiting, almost holding its breath. What would Crockett do? Would she match sarcasm with sarcasm, fall into the trap of trading insults? Or would she deliver something entirely unexpected, something that rewrote the rules in that instant? Everyone in the room felt it. This was a moment that could not be walked back. Whatever happened next would not just end up in the transcript. It would be remembered, replayed, immortalized. A single response could flip the script, and the world was about to find out whether Graham's laughter was the beginning of a win or the seed of his undoing. And the reason Graham laughed? That's where the story truly begins to understand. The weight of that laugh, one has to understand the man behind it. Lindsey Graham did not arrive at that moment as a blank slate. He carried with him years of reputation, a carefully cultivated persona, and a long record of wielding sarcasm like a blade. For decades, Graham had walked the corridors of power with the confidence of someone who believed his seat was secure, his authority unquestioned. He thrived in the politics of belittlement, using humor, mockery, and contradiction to diminish those who dared to challenge him. From the beginning of his career, Graham mastered a certain theater of politics. He learned quickly that laughter, even when empty, could disarm opponents. A dismissive chuckle here, a smirk there. He knew the performance well. For him, debate wasn't always about facts or ideas. It was about posture, about proving that his word carried more weight simply because he had the microphone longer, the title higher, the connections deeper. That laugh in the Senate chamber wasn't born in isolation. It was the product of years, of habit, an old reflex pulled from the same bag of tricks he had used countless times before. Critics had long noted his contradictions. He could be fiery in one moment, conciliatory in the next. He could denounce an action one year and defend it the next, often with little more than a shrug to bridge the inconsistency. Yet, through it all, one constant remained, his reliance on dismissiveness as a shield. If cornered, he laughed. If questioned, he mocked. If challenged, he belittled. It was a pattern so predictable that those familiar with his style could almost hear the punchline before it left his lips. This strategy was not without its successes. In the old guard of politics, mockery often carried further than reason. Cameras loved it, headlines amplified it, and supporters cheered the appearance of strength. Graham thrived in this space, leaning into the idea that arrogance could masquerade as authority. For years, it worked. His smirks became his signature, his sarcasm a weapon sharpened by repetition. He built a reputation as someone who could laugh off confrontation and still walk away unscathed. But underneath that veneer of confidence lay the cracks. Arrogance, after all, only holds power when left unchallenged. A laugh works when it silences the room, not when it invites scrutiny. And over time, As the nation shifted and new voices entered the political stage, Graham's old tricks began to lose their shine. What once looked like strength began to resemble entitlement. What once passed as wit began to look like dismissal of voices that demanded to be heard. That was the backdrop when his laugh rang out in the chamber. To some, it was just another instance of Graham being Graham. To others, it was a reminder of every time dignity had been brushed aside by mockery, every time arrogance had drowned out truth. His laugh was not just about the moment. It symbolized a larger pattern, one where power protected itself by belittling opposition. Contrast that with the figure sitting across from him. Jasmine Crockett, younger, newer, carrying with her the urgency of a changing America. Where Graham represented the politics of comfort and status, Crockett embodied the politics of resilience and fight. His laugh was the sound of the old guard clinging to its authority. Her stare was the silence of a new generation refusing to yield. The irony, of course, is that Graham likely thought little of it. To him, the laugh was routine, a move played countless times before. Perhaps he expected Crockett to bristle, to fumble, to react in anger. Perhaps he believed the moment would end as so many others had, with him in control, his opponent diminished, the chamber moving on. He underestimated the strength sitting across from him, because while Graham's laugh was an old trick, Crockett's silence was something new. She didn't meet arrogance with irritation. She met it with calm resolve. She didn't rush to fill the silence he left behind. She let it weigh on the room until the arrogance behind it was laid bare. And in that stillness, Graham's laugh no longer looked like strength. It looked like insecurity dressed up as confidence. For years, he had relied on the same script, certain that laughter could erase the sting of contradiction. But in this chamber, on this day, facing this opponent, the old playbook no longer worked. But this time, Graham underestimated who he was dealing with. To understand why the silence after Graham's laugh carried such weight, one must look at the woman who held it. Jasmine Crockett did not walk into that chamber as a novice seeking approval, nor as a politician trying to perform for cameras. She arrived as someone who had already fought her way through challenges most could barely imagine. Every moment of her journey had forged the calm, steady force that now stared across the table at a man who thought his laugh could erase her. Crockett's story begins far from the marble walls of Washington, in a world where nothing was handed down and everything had to be fought for. She was not born into legacy power, nor did she inherit connections that smoothed the way. Instead, she carved her path through persistence, scholarship, and the unshakable conviction that justice wasn't a luxury for the privileged, but a necessity for everyone. Her earliest days in public service were not on a national stage, but in the trenches of advocacy. As a public defender and attorney, Crockett faced lives broken by inequality, cases ignored by indifference, and people discarded by a system too quick to judge and too slow to understand. In crowded courtrooms, she stood beside clients who could barely afford representation, giving them not just legal counsel but dignity in spaces that often stripped it away. For her, justice was never theoretical. It was personal, immediate, and urgent. Those battles earned her a reputation. She was fierce, unrelenting, unwilling to be silenced. Judges, prosecutors, and colleagues learned quickly that when Jasmine Crockett entered the room, she brought more than arguments. She brought the weight of lived reality, the authority of someone who had walked with those most affected by the law. Her voice carried not because it was the loudest, but because it was rooted in truth. It was this grounding that propelled her into political life. When she entered the legislature in Texas, she did so not as a polished insider, but as an unapologetic advocate. She didn't trade in platitudes or calculated half-promises. Instead, she spoke in the language of those she served. Direct, raw, real. Her colleagues might have had decades of seniority, but Crockett had something different: authenticity. That authenticity resonated with people far beyond her district. It marked her as someone unwilling to bow to the usual games, someone who carried the same courage into the halls of power that she had carried into courtrooms. Her rise was not without obstacles. She faced the dismissals, the interruptions, the constant undertone of doubt that so often greets women of color in positions of authority. She knew what it meant to be underestimated, to have her intelligence questioned, to endure the quiet sneers of those who thought she didn't belong. And yet, instead of bending under that weight, she turned it into fuel. Each condescending remark sharpened her focus. Each attempt to sideline her strengthened her resolve. Crockett's style was not flamboyant for the sake of spectacle. Her fire came from necessity. When voices go unheard, sometimes they need to be raised. When arguments are ignored, sometimes they need to be delivered with sharper edges. That edge made her both respected and feared. Her speeches weren't carefully polished sound bites. They were the unfiltered truth of someone who had seen too much inequity to settle for politeness when dignity was at stake. This was the reputation she carried into Washington. By the time she faced Graham across that committee table, she had already established herself as a force impossible to dismiss. She was known for her command of detail, her ability to cut through bluster with precision, and her refusal to be cowed by seniority. Where others sought to navigate the hierarchy of power quietly, Crockett confronted it head-on. And yet, behind the fierceness lay something deeper, a steadiness, a groundedness that made her power sustainable. She did not fight out of ego, but out of principle. She did not speak to elevate herself, but to give voice to those who rarely had one in rooms like this. That authenticity was her armor, and it made her impervious to the usual weapons of mockery and dismissal. So when Graham's laugh echoed through the chamber, it was not the first time Crockett had faced belittlement. She had heard it before. Different voices, different contexts, the same message. You don't belong here. But each time she had proven otherwise. And now, with the cameras rolling and the nation watching, she was ready to prove it again. Her silence in that moment was not hesitation. It was calculation. It was the stillness of someone who knew the value of timing, someone who understood that words, when delivered with precision, could shatter arrogance more completely than anger ever could. She was not rattled. She was ready. Every courtroom, every floor debate, every moment of struggle had led to this. Her rise, her battles, her unshakable authenticity, all of it had forged a presence that even Graham's laughter could not diminish. And as the seconds ticked by, it became clear that the laugh, which once seemed dismissive, had instead drawn the spotlight directly to her. The stage was set. The contrast was undeniable. Graham, leaning on the old tricks of entitlement and mockery. Crockett, standing firm on the foundation of lived truth and earned respect. And all of that firepower was about to ignite in one unforgettable moment. The laugh had landed, but the moment did not pass. Instead, it lingered, vibrating through the chamber like a note no one wanted to claim. Graham, sensing the silence but misreading its meaning, leaned in with that practiced air of superiority. His voice carried the tone of a man amused with himself, unbothered by the gravity of the discussion before him. He dismissed questions with a casual shrug, punctuated his sentences with smirks, and treated the proceedings less as a forum for truth than as a stage for his own performance. Around the table, the discomfort was palpable. A few colleagues shifted in their chairs, eyes darting between the two figures locked in unspoken tension. Staffers scribbled notes they didn't need to write, reporters adjusted their recorders, and the faint hum of cameras seemed louder than ever. Everyone sensed the imbalance. One side cloaked in arrogance, the other waiting, measured, unshaken, for the right moment. Graham pressed on, clearly convinced the laughter had already tilted the dynamic in his favor. He spoke with exaggerated incredulity, framing Crockett's words as naive, her perspective as overreach. Each time he finished, his eyes wandered the room, as if searching for allies to join his mockery. yet few offered more than tight-lipped, half smiles, unwilling to fully embrace the tone he had set. The laughter that once seemed effortless now carried a hollow echo, exposing itself as a performance rather than power. Crockett remained still. Her expression betrayed no rush to answer, no scramble to reclaim footing. Instead, she let Graham's words pile higher, each dismissive phrase adding weight to the arrogance already hanging in the room. She didn't interrupt. She didn't rush. She simply held her ground, gathering her energy the way a storm gathers clouds, quiet, steady, inevitable. For the viewers at home, suspense was building with every pause. On one screen, Graham looked pleased, as though he had landed the upper hand. On another, Crockett's eyes told a different story. Patient, deliberate, poised. Audiences could feel the tension in their own living rooms, as if they were leaning forward with the committee itself. The silence between Graham's barbs and Crockett's eventual reply became more dramatic than the insults themselves. It was a study in contrast. Graham filled the chamber with noise, laughter, sarcasm, interruptions. Crockett filled it with quiet power, her silence commanding more attention than his smirk. Even those who often agreed with Graham seemed uneasy. His routine was familiar, but against Crockett's composure, it looked less like strength and more like desperation. The escalation was subtle, yet undeniable. With each passing moment, the balance of the room shifted. Graham's confidence, built on ridicule, began to teeter under the weight of its own repetition. Crockett's calm presence, on the other hand, grew heavier with potential, like a bowstring pulled tighter and tighter, waiting for release. By now, the committee chamber was alive with anticipation. Even the air felt charged, as though everyone inside knew they were witnesses to something more than routine debate. It was not just about the policy at hand. It was about respect, about dignity, about who truly commanded the floor. Every laugh Graham offered only amplified the question. What would Crockett say when she finally chose to speak? The suspense was almost unbearable. Phones buzzed silently under the table as aides texted colleagues, "You need to see this." Outside the room, clips of Graham's laugh were already circulating online, paired with headlines asking how Crockett would respond. Inside, she had yet to utter a single word in reply, and yet she was winning the room without speaking. And then, the moment arrived. Crockett shifted slightly, her posture unchanged but her intention unmistakable. Her hands, steady until now, rested firmly on the table. She leaned in, closing the space between silence and speech, her eyes never leaving Graham's. The noise of the chamber, the scribbling pens, the clearing throats, the restless shuffling, faded into nothing. Then Crockett leaned forward, and the room fell silent. The silence in the chamber stretched long enough to become unbearable. Then, with a steady breath, Jasmine Crockett finally spoke. Her voice was calm, measured, deliberate, but every syllable cut through the air with unmistakable force. She did not raise her volume, but somehow it felt louder than Graham's laughter had moments before. "Senator," she began, her tone carrying the sharpness of steel wrapped in velvet, "you may find this amusing. You may think it's appropriate to laugh when the stakes are this high, but the people I represent, the people who sent me here, they don't find it amusing at all." A ripple moved through the room. Heads turned, pens froze mid-scribble. The first strike had landed, not with fury but with clarity. Graham's smirk faltered, just slightly, as Crockett pressed on. "You laugh because it is easy. Easy to mock, easy to dismiss, easy to wave off voices you don't want to hear. But let me remind you, history does not remember the laughter of those who mocked. History remembers the voices that stood tall in the face of it." There was a pause, intentional, heavy. Crockett let the silence speak as loudly as her words. Viewers across the nation leaned closer to their screens. In that pause, the weight of truth gathered, and then she struck again. "You laugh at me, Senator. But you are not laughing at me alone. You are laughing at every family that has struggled to be heard. You are laughing at the idea that dignity matters, that service matters, that truth matters. And while you may laugh today, I assure you, tomorrow belongs to those of us who refuse to bow to arrogance. The murmurs began. Low, startled, building. Graham shifted, tapping his pen against the desk, his earlier amusement draining as Crockett's words dug deeper. She was not shouting, not grandstanding. She was building a case, brick by brick, laying out an indictment that went far beyond the man in front of her. You claim to serve this country, but service is not measured in the number of years a title has sat next to your name. It is measured in the respect you show for the people who entrusted you with that title. And right now, your laughter tells them everything they need to know about how little you value that trust. Gasps scattered across the chamber. Graham's lips pressed together, his jaw tightening. The smirk that had once seemed effortless now looked brittle. He tried to interject, but Crockett raised a hand. Not loud, not forceful, just firm enough to hold the floor. No, Senator, you've had your turn. The floor is mine now. The words landed with the weight of authority, and the room seemed to tilt toward her. Cameras zoomed, lenses capturing the unraveling of Graham's carefully curated mask. Crockett pressed forward. Let's talk about service. Let's talk about sacrifice. Let's talk about the people who come here with nothing but conviction, who stand their ground because they believe in something bigger than themselves. That's why I am here. That's why I will not be laughed into silence. The chamber was alive now. Gasps, murmurs, whispered exclamations. Graham adjusted his tie, his discomfort plain. Crockett allowed the tension to grow, then broke it with precision. You think laughter protects you. It doesn't. It exposes you. It reveals fear masquerading as arrogance, entitlement pretending to be strength. Because if you truly believed your arguments, you wouldn't need to laugh at mine. The audience reaction was electric. Some leaned back in shock, others nodded subtly in agreement. The smirk was gone now, replaced by a tight-lipped stare. Crockett had seized the room, and she knew it. Every time you dismiss me, Senator, you dismiss the people who cannot sit at this table. But I am here for them. I will not let your mockery become their silence. I will not allow your arrogance to stand unchallenged. Because this chamber does not belong to you or to me. It belongs to the people. The words resonated, reverberating, like a gavel striking wood. Graham's pen, once tapping with confidence, now lay still. His eyes darted briefly to colleagues but found little comfort there. Crockett pressed the advantage. You want to laugh? Fine. But understand this. Laughter fades, truth endures. And the truth is that dignity, service, and respect are not weaknesses to be mocked. They are the very foundation of this country. That's what I stand on. That's what I fight for. The chamber erupted in murmurs again, louder this time, echoing off marble walls. Crockett held her ground, her face calm, her voice unwavering. And so, Senator, when history writes about this day, it will not write about your laughter. It will write about how you were silenced, not by anger, not by noise, but by the undeniable force of truth spoken with dignity. She drew in a breath, her eyes sweeping across the chamber as though to remind every person present that this was bigger than a clash of personalities. I did not come here to trade barbs or to be entertainment for anyone watching. I came here because my constituents demanded a voice, because they demanded someone who would not look away when injustice laughed in their faces. That is my purpose, and I will not shrink from it. There was another pause, longer this time, daring Graham to interrupt. He did not. She pressed forward, her words gaining momentum. The people who sent me here, they do not sit in luxury. They sit in classrooms that do not have enough books, in hospitals that cannot afford enough doctors, in neighborhoods where respect is too often denied. They are watching now, wondering if anyone in this chamber will truly hear them. And when they see you laugh, Senator, they see the same dismissal they have lived with their whole lives. They see power sneering at their struggle. But I see them, and I will not let them be laughed away. The room stirred again, the impact undeniable. Even those who had grown accustomed to Washington's pageantry recognized that something extraordinary was unfolding. This was not a rehearsed speech, it was a reckoning. Crockett's voice deepened with conviction. So yes, laugh if you must. But remember this, your laughter will echo only as far as these walls. My words, the truth I speak here today, will echo far beyond them. They will live in the people, in their memory, and in their resolve to build a country where their dignity is not optional. By now, Graham's silence spoke louder than his mockery ever had. The smirk was gone, replaced by a thin line of frustration. Crockett leaned back slightly, her final words landing like a verdict. And that, Senator, is why arrogance will never prevail over truth. There it was, the mic drop moment, the turning point, the instant where the smirk finally cracked. Beyond repair. Graham sat rigid, his hand clenched around the pen, his face a mask betraying the strain underneath. Crockett leaned back, her point made, her silence now louder than any laugh could ever be. The chamber buzzed, the audience still reeling from the blow. What began as a dismissive laugh had ended as a devastating lesson. The clash was no longer equal. The scales had tipped, and everyone knew it, but the real explosion didn't happen in that chamber. The moment the words left Jasmine Crockett's lips, the ripple began. It started with a hush in the chamber, the kind of silence that only follows when something undeniable has been spoken. But within minutes, that silence transformed into noise, digital noise, the kind that doesn't just echo within four walls but explodes across an entire nation. Clips of the exchange hit social media almost instantly. A staffer's phone caught. The exact moment Graham's smirk faded, another clip zoomed in on Crockett's unwavering stare, and soon the internet was ablaze. Twitter timelines filled with side-by-side screenshots. Graham laughing, Crockett delivering her thunderous reply. TikTok edits cut the moment into cinematic montages, layering dramatic music beneath her words. Instagram Reels looped her final lines like a rallying cry. The hashtags were inevitable. Cheers, Crockett, clap back, laugh no more, dignity wins. By the end of the hour, her words had been replayed millions of times. Laughter fades, truth endures. It wasn't just a line, it was a banner. It spread beyond political circles, seeping into everyday conversations. College students quoted it in dorm debates. Parents shared it at kitchen tables. Workers texted it in group chats on lunch breaks. What had started as a committee exchange was now a cultural flashpoint. Commentators rushed in to capture the moment. On cable news, panelists debated the meaning of Crockett's counterattack. Some framed it as a generational shift. The younger, unflinching voices refusing to bow to the old guard's mockery. Others called it a masterclass in composure, proof that dignity could silence arrogance more effectively than shouting ever could. And even those hesitant to side with her politically admitted the obvious. She had owned the moment. Celebrities added fuel to the fire. Actors, musicians, athletes, voices with millions of followers began sharing clips of Crockett's words, some with one-line captions. This. The viral energy grew exponential. Her takedown was no longer confined to the political world. It had become a universal lesson in how to confront ridicule with poise. Even late-night hosts seized it. Monologues opened with Graham's laugh, replayed on a loop to audience groans, before cutting to Crockett's reply, greeted with cheers. Memes proliferated. Someone edited Graham's laugh into a sitcom laugh. Track, followed by Crockett's takedown, turning the exchange into both comedy and drama. Others compared it to cinematic scenes, the hero standing tall while the villain collapses under their own arrogance. But beneath the humor and viral edits, there was something more serious brewing. Voters across the country began discussing what the moment symbolized. For many, it wasn't just about two politicians sparring. It was about how respect is earned and how arrogance is exposed. Letters to editors, op-eds, and podcasts repeated the same theme. Crockett's calm force represented the kind of leadership people longed for: direct, authentic, unwilling to bend before mockery. Graham, for once, avoided cameras. Reporters noted his absence in the usual press scrums, his evasiveness when asked about the laugh. The silence from his side only amplified the impact of Crockett's words. The more he avoided, the larger the story grew. The narrative was clear. The old guard had been rattled, and the new voice had carried the day. Crockett, meanwhile, found herself at the center of a storm she hadn't sought but had undeniably commanded. Her team was inundated with interview requests, her phone with messages of support from strangers across the country. She accepted a few, speaking not with gloating, but with the same steady dignity that had defined her moment in the chamber. "It's not about me," she repeated. "It's about respecting the people we all serve." That humility only added to the resonance. The political world took notice, too. Colleagues who had once underestimated her now spoke of her with respect, even admiration. Younger lawmakers privately told reporters they felt emboldened by her stance, that her refusal to bow to ridicule gave them permission to hold their ground more firmly. What had been one sharp exchange had turned into a shift in posture, proof that arrogance could be dismantled with truth, not just tolerated. And so the shockwaves spread outward. What began with a laugh and a stare became a national lesson, a viral anthem, a rallying cry. Crockett had not only silenced Graham in the moment, she had flipped the script for how power itself was perceived. Arrogance was no longer untouchable. Mockery was no longer the final word. Dignity, calm and unyielding, had claimed the floor. The headlines summed it up best: Crockett turns laugh into silence and a movement. But this was not the end. For as loud as the noise became in the hours after, the days that followed revealed what truly mattered. Beyond hashtags, beyond clips, beyond viral memes, one message began to emerge above all others, steady and insistent. And in the days that followed, one message rang louder than all the noise. In the days that followed, as headlines blared and hashtags trended, Jasmine Crockett's words began to transcend the moment itself. What had started as a clash in a committee room quickly became a parable, retold in classrooms, workplaces, and conversations across the country. People weren't just repeating her lines, they were attaching meaning to them, weaving them into their own stories. The exchange had become larger than politics. It had become a reminder of something every person instinctively knows but often forgets. Dignity is stronger than mockery. Crockett herself seemed intent on framing it that way. In interviews, she declined the temptation to celebrate Graham's embarrassment. She didn't gloat or replay the clip for her own glory. Instead, she emphasized the values at the heart of her stand. "Respect matters," she said in one interview. "Service matters. And when we lose sight of that, we lose sight of why any of us are here." Those words landed because they carried no hint of self-congratulation, only conviction. Audiences responded to that conviction. Teachers wrote posts about using Crockett's moment to show students that confidence isn't measured in volume, but in principle. Community leaders invoked her words at town halls, reminding people that power isn't in the laugh of the arrogant, but in the resolve of the dignified. Even beyond politics, the story resonated with anyone who had ever been underestimated, mocked, or dismissed. Crockett had modeled what it looked like to stand firm without trading dignity for fury. The morale became clear. Arrogance is loud, but it is fleeting. Dignity is quiet, but it endures. Crockett's calm dismantling of Graham's laugh proved that mockery might dominate a moment, but truth shapes the legacy. People saw in her composure a path forward, proof that one does not have to match disrespect with disrespect. Instead, one can rise above it, and in doing so, expose it for what it truly is: weakness masquerading as strength. For many, this was the lasting lesson. The country had grown accustomed to politics as spectacle, shouting matches, viral insults, the currency of outrage. But Crockett's moment offered a counter-vision: politics as service, rooted not in theatrics, but in respect for the people watching. She reminded the public that leadership is not measured by how loudly you can mock your opponent, but by how steadfastly you can honor your purpose. The ripple effect was not just in how people viewed Graham and Crockett, but in how they viewed themselves. Everyday citizens began to share their own stories, moments when they too had been laughed at, dismissed, or minimized, and how Crockett's example gave them courage to hold their ground. Social media filled with personal testimonies. Workers standing up to bosses, students speaking up in classrooms, parents teaching their children that dignity is not weakness, but power. Her words had become more than commentary. They had become a blueprint. And as Crockett spoke more about the incident, she consistently pulled the focus back to universal values. "This isn't about one senator or one representative," she said. "It's about what kind of country we want to be. Do we want to be a country where arrogance rules? Or do we want to be a country where service, respect, and dignity define us?" The question resonated because it was bigger than Washington. It was about workplaces, schools, neighborhoods, families. It was about the daily choice between laughing off someone else's struggle and listening to it with compassion. Crockett had shown in real time that even in the halls of power, dignity could triumph. By the end of that week, the viral clip had already faded into the endless churn of online content. But the message had not. It lingered, echoing quietly but persistently, reminding people that laughter may dominate the moment, but it cannot write the ending. Truth, respect, and service, these are the forces that endure. And so the incident closed not as a story about mockery, but as a story about resilience. Crockett had reframed the laugh into a lesson, one that could not be erased by time or noise. She had proven that while arrogance may seem untouchable, it is no match for dignity rooted in service. Which leaves us with only one question. Lindsey Graham's laugh was meant to dismiss, to reduce an opponent to nothing more than a punchline. But Jasmine Crockett's response turned that moment on its head. What began as arrogance ended in silence, and what began as mockery became a stage for truth. This was more than a single exchange. It was a symbol of something larger, something many Americans feel in their own lives. When dignity is challenged, when respect is denied, when arrogance sneers, there is still power in standing tall and speaking truth. Crockett's victory in that chamber was not just hers. It belonged to every person who has ever been laughed at for daring to speak, every voice brushed aside by those who believed themselves untouchable. She showed, in real time, that composure can be stronger than volume, and that truth has the power to outlast even the loudest ridicule. This is why her words traveled beyond Washington. They struck a chord because they weren't only about politics. They were about how we live, how we treat one another, and what kind of future we want to shape. Graham's laugh may have filled a moment, but Crockett's message filled a movement. And now, that movement includes you. If you believe that dignity should never be mocked, if you believe that service matters more than arrogance, then let this moment be a reminder and a call. Share this story. Carry it into your conversations, and refuse to let laughter erase truth. Subscribe for more stories where arrogance is confronted by dignity, and where truth stands its ground. Share this video so others can see what it looks like when mockery loses and resilience wins. Because in the end, history doesn't remember the laugh. It remembers the courage that silenced it.